All right, here with me now in the studio to try and take a closer look at this controversial court override bill are Israeli advocate and Assistant Director of Standing Together, Ari Fuld, Attorney of Constitutional and Administrative Law, Hadas, and Bar-Yoshafat, Attorney, Public Diplomacy Expert and Lecturer. Sorry about butchering your names. Thank you all very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
Okay, so my first question I'll actually kind of open over here. Do you agree with the court override bill, and why or why not? I'll start with you, Hadas.
Thank you. I have to say that I feel very inconvenient with this clause, since the explicit intention of this clause is to narrow the jurisdiction and the discretion of the Supreme Court judges. And I think that if we look back since the legislation of the basic laws in Israel, the Supreme Court has acted very, very seriously and with a lot of discretion while interpreting the laws. So I think that going in this way and saying that the Supreme Court is being too much activistic is very, very troubling.
So, again, I want to remind everyone that this law actually is not new. It was actually Aaron Barak, the president of the Supreme Court, with Yitzhak Rabin at the time, and his government with merits in the government. When they were talking about bringing pig into the country, it was Aaron Barak himself who made this law. He said, no problem, the Knesset can make a new law and override the Supreme Court. So I'm not sure who's really breaking the laws here, because it was actually the Supreme Court itself who put out this clause in 1992, I believe it was.
Yeah, but
in terms of the courts itself, it's clearly obvious to everyone in Israel they've got involved in every aspect of political life. Now, there's not another place in the world, where the Supreme Court are elected by themselves and can outdo the jurisdiction of the parliament.
They're not elected by themselves. They have a committee.
There's a committee where the judges themselves have the veto of people who can get in. That's self-elected, in my opinion.
Ron, I understand you have a bit of a different take.
Here's what I find interesting. For some reason, people in Israel think that the Supreme Court will always have a better saying than the public and its representatives. And I'm not really sure why. Why would people trust the Supreme Court more than themselves, than the representative of the public? Now, here's a scenario. Let's say that in 10 years from now, all of the Supreme Court judges will all be hawkish right-wingers. Will the left still want the Supreme Court to have so much power? How about we'll have a system?
Very good question.
How about we'll have a system that says this is a proper system if you're in the coalition, if you're in the position, if you're a right-wing judge, if you're a left-wing judge. And currently the situation is that the Supreme Court, that the fact that we're saying the Supreme Court can overrule the legislative branch, it's weird. It doesn't make any sense. That's not how democracy works. The purpose of a Supreme Court in any democracy is to make sure that the current administration is not undermining the norms of a society. It's not supposed to set the norms of the society.
But it's my understanding that the courts are there to interpret the law and are not to put any partisanship into their decisions.
In theory, if that was the case, I would be supportive of that. I don't want to cancel the Supreme Court, but I'm saying that currently the Supreme Court is not working according to interpretations. It gave itself power.
So, okay, so then wouldn't that be a better solution, to have the court function according to interpretations of the law rather than this kind of partisan thing that we then have to override?
The question, who's got the last word? Is it the government that's elected, or is it the Supreme Court that wasn't? And in most places, it's the government that's elected. There is, again, you have in Canada, you have another place in the world where you have this overriding rule, but the last word should be given by the people. The Supreme Court were not voted in. In America, the Supreme Court judges are put up there by the president. It's a political. Here in Israel, it's their own little group, and it's really, to take the power out of the people is undemocratic.
I think that democracy is not just the power of the people. It's also the ability to protect minorities, and we see it with the asylums regarding your So
they're not a minority of the country. They're illegal aliens. They're illegal infiltrators.
So that's
in your opinion.
No,
in other people's opinion, they are people which are being in danger.
No, according to the law, they are not.
Well, so that's I think in debate, because if we're going to talk about who has applied, who's faced difficulty in applying for asylum, who qualifies for refugee status.
In order to get asylum status, you have to apply.
I think that's a more complicated issue that we don't really have time to get into. But yeah,
three short points here. Number one, I'm not sure why the assumption is that the Supreme Court will take care of minorities, but the government will not. Let's say the Supreme Court is all right-wing, hawkish judges and the government is all left-wing. I'm not sure that that's going to be, for my benefit.
But the judges right now are being elected by their professional skills, not by their political opinions.
So you trust people. You think that this group of people that I cannot change, I cannot touch their salary, they're there until their pension. You trust them more. A tiny group, that's dictatorship. That's not democracy.
These are the things that provide them the ability to make decisions professionally and not by political.
Tyranny. That's tyranny. Trusting a small group of people. That's tyranny.
Why does this group of people, according to your opinion, have the moral compass to decide for the nation? I'm a little confused by that.
Well,
it's not the moral; it's the legal.
Hold on, because that's what I want to get at. I mean, is this a fair checks and balance kind of system the way that it is, and if it's not, what needs to be done to make it a fair check and balance? Is this the answer?
I think that if we review the cases in which the Supreme Court has overruled other laws, we see that it's very few laws which are very problematic. If we talk about the asylums, for example,
and if we talk
about things,
they gave citizenship to a Hamasnik who the government said they take away his citizenship.
It's not just that.
Hold on.
You would not even start the legislation process because you'll say, well, at the end, the Supreme Court is going to overrule it. So the fact that you're cutting it,
the chilling effect is very important, I think.
I think it's
this
undemocratic.
Is a good chilling effect.
But just to continue that, just in 2017, there were 5 laws that have been cancelled. So there's also a trend. The fact that you can say, well, in 1960, they only cancelled 1 law. Okay, but in 2017, they've cancelled 5 laws,
and
not all of the laws. Not all of the laws are so in the heart of our debate in the Israeli society. There's a law that says how much pension you can give people that have a car. The Knesset said one thing. The Supreme Court said no. In 2012, everyone has a car. You need to. Are you experts in economics, in finance, whatever? How come you have the final word in that? Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So I think that there are only few laws that were overruled by the Supreme Court since the constitutional revolution of '92, and since even the previous verdicts of the Supreme Court, which says that the Supreme Court has the right to interpret the law and say if it's constitutional or not. I think that there are not more than 15.
21.
21? Okay, so 21. It's a very reasonable
the
number.
verdicts gave themselves the power. The Supreme Court gave itself the power to overrule laws.
So I have a follow-up question then. Let's say that the Knesset coalition passes this overrule law. What's a fair number in the Knesset vote to overrule that? Is it 61? Is it 70?
This already
80?
exists. This already exists in the world. It exists in Canada, I believe it, but it exists also in the UK, if I'm not mistaken.
In many countries.
In many countries. And the idea is the following. The idea is the power goes to the people. Again, you have to understand, during Nazi time, which I'm not comparing anything, the courts had the power to break the laws. They didn't do it. If you're worried about the moral standards, I have trust in the nation. I do. And they vote for their leaders. To say that a closed group of people, of elitists, have the power to shut down the Knesset, the power of the people is ridiculous.
So then again, what's fair? What's a fair number? Because in other Western parties, we're talking at least 2/3 majority to overrule
anything. No, I don't need that. Either 61 or 1 to 2. In other words, either it's just a majority, which, by the way, in 1992, that's what it was.
But it's simple.
No, it's not true. In Canada, you need a regular majority, okay, to overrule the Supreme Court. But here's the thing. I'm not against the Supreme Court. I'm very happy I have a Supreme Court. If anything, it's the opposite. I want to trust my Supreme Court. I currently do not trust him. And how many people will you have to have in order to overrule that the verdicts? It's only one part of it. Also, we have the seniority, the fact that the older you are, that's how high you're ranked in the system. The fact that they nominate themselves, I think, is a problem, and we need to address it. It's the whole structure of checks and balances. Sure. And I want to strengthen the Supreme Court in a different sense, in the fact that I want to trust it. And currently, I do not trust my Supreme Court, and I think it's very problematic.
Hadas, final comments, the response, if you have them?
Yeah, I think that when we look at the Supreme Court's decision, right on the last days, we see that the Supreme Court is very restricted. There are a lot of petitions. There are hundreds and thousands of petitions which are being filed to the court, and yet the court always says that it trusts and gives a lot of discretion to the ministry and to the Knesset. It only overrules the decisions while there is a basic problem with it.
Like if it's in contravention.
Let's just give a few examples. Drafting of Haredi people, the people who are allowed to come.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'd love to keep going, but unfortunately that's all the time we have. So anyway, thank you all very much for coming in. Ari Fuld, Hadas, Brave, and Bar-Yoshafat. Thank you very much.